Despite wanting to enlist together, Art and Dan ended up effectively crossing paths, with Art just leaving to deploy to Europe at the same time Dan was returning from his tour. Art ended up leaving New York in December of 1944 via a troop transport ship. It was part of a convoy that took a 16-day journey across the North Atlantic. They were limited by the slowest ship in the convoy and made constant course corrections to reduce the risk of U-boat attacks. They ended up arriving at Le Havre in France and immediately were transported down into the Alsace-Lorraine region to deploy against a German offensive that had just taken place. Art ended up seeing his first action against the German light armor units along the French and German border near Trier. After having trained on use of the Bazooka anti-tank rocket, Art was the gunner in a two-man Bazooka team that was attached to an infantry unit in Patton's Third Army. Art was in a unique position in that, while many of the troops he was with were brand new recruits, he had actually been in the army for several years and was promoted to sergeant soon after arriving in France. He said the fighting was extremely heavy, and they were operating in the area north of what was known as the Colmar Pocket, which was an area where the Germans had advanced in a counterattack just prior to his arrival. He said the typical pattern was they would advance for 2 to 3 days and then either dig in or fall back for a day, then repeat over and over and over again. He said it was very heavy resistance, but overall they were always advancing, always making several days of gains with maybe 1 day of falling back. So there was no doubt as to what was happening. The Germans were clearly in retreat. He said they were heading generally in a northeast direction, obviously towards Berlin, and continued this for several months, crossing both the Saar and then the Rhine rivers. Shortly after the Third Army crossed the Rhine, they were issued new orders and ended up wheeling to the southeast to move into Bavaria and head towards the German city of Regensburg, which they ended up reaching in April of 1945. As Art and the other Allied troops entered Regensburg, they noticed that there was an incredible cathedral that they were all marveling at, and what they really were impressed by was that the cathedral had really almost no damage to it, and yet was right next to an aircraft plant that had been repeatedly bombed into rubble. The soldiers were impressed with how accurate the U.S. bomber crews had been. When they had arrived, it was on a Saturday, and the next Sunday, the city bishop came out and was going to hold Mass for the first time in several years. Art ended up serving as a volunteer altar boy, since there had been no altar boys allowed to be trained under Nazi rule, and he had served as an altar boy as a child. He said it was one of the most unique experiences he had, serving as an altar boy in uniform, still in the middle of a combat zone. He had said this was a prime example of kind of a bizarre duality he experienced, where they would be in heavy combat and yet at the same time be in some of the most beautiful places he'd ever seen, and then have something so out of place as serving as an altar boy, and yet knowing the next day they would likely be back moving towards the front to engage in combat yet again. He also experienced some rather unusual occurrences when they started looking through records in the city, and they knew that they had been fighting some home guard units, meaning instead of regular German forces, it had been local militias drawn up from the area, and he started seeing a lot of people with his own last name. He knew his grandfather had been from the area, but actually had no contact with any German relatives, so it was more of a curiosity than anything else, but it was something that ended up staying with him. Soon they were on the move again, still heading southeast, and this time heading through the Black Forest into Austria. Once they entered the Black Forest, he again experienced some of the most beautiful scenery he'd ever seen, and the fighting was still intense at times, but increasingly sporadic, as the German resistance was clearly less organized and less present than it had been at other places. As they progressed through this pattern of many days of virtually no contact, interspersed with brief bursts of heavy fighting, they eventually reached and then occupied Linz, Austria, in May of 1945. This was actually Hitler's hometown. It was with an attachment from one of the units there that Art liberated the Gaussen concentration camp, which was a subcamp of the Mauthausen camp. The Gaussen camp held primarily Polish prisoners, along with some Soviet, Italian, and Spanish Republican prisoners, who were being used as forced labor and essentially being worked to death in quarries nearby Linz. Like all U.S. troops, they were shocked by what they found, even though at this point in the war, they had been forewarned that these camps had been discovered and given some idea of what to expect. Actually walking into them and seeing the conditions was something none of them were prepared for. He said it was an unusual situation that the opportunity to leave one of those camps and return to combat was actually appealing. After only about 48 hours in Linz and the surrounding concentration camps, Art's anti-tank unit was assigned to another infantry group that was now going to be tasked with continuing on and invading Austria further and capturing the city of Vienna. He was relieved to be out of the area and away from the concentration camps, and said at this point the anti-tank unit role was largely ceremonial. For the most part, didn't even carry his bazooka anymore, and had picked up a Browning automatic rifle that he had initially trained on and used that and served as a support gunner, and only brought out the bazooka if they actually ran into any armor, which was rare, especially operating in the heavily forested regions like the Black Forest around Linz. So as this unit proceeded, they geared up for the advance on Vienna and proceeded to head southeast again. They'd only gone for about 3 days when the unit was halted, and within a few hours, when word started spreading throughout the camp that the Germans had surrendered and the war in Europe was over. So this was soon confirmed by their officers.
This is a solemn but glorious hour. I wish that Franklin D. Roosevelt had lived to see this day. General Eisenhower informs me that the forces of Germany have surrendered to the United Nations. The flags of freedom fly all over Europe. For this victory, we join in offering our thanks to the Providence which has guided and sustained us through the dark days of adversity and into light.
They ended up spending the night there and then returning to Linz the following morning. He stayed in Linz for a few days, and then he and the rest of his units were loaded up into cattle cars and driven back to Le Havre, where they remained for another 6 weeks, awaiting transport, with many of the heavy troop transport ships already having been redeployed. So they ended up boarding an ocean liner, which, although it was overcrowded, was a much better transport vessel than riding on the Spartan troop ships that had brought them over, and returned back to the United States. Once back in the United States, he ended up deploying to Camp Shelby, Mississippi, and was awaiting possible orders to see if he would need to be deployed to the Pacific for combat operations against the Japanese.